In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Falls, Montana, a young woman clutched a crumpled letter that would change her destiny forever. She had no idea that the humble farmer who'd promised her a simple life was actually one of the wealthiest landowners in the entire territory, or that her arrival would set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the town's power structure. The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the well-worn trail, sending Cordelia Ashworth's modest traveling bag sliding across the cramped compartment. She steadied herself against the worn leather seat, her green eyes scanning the endless expanse of Montana wilderness stretching beyond the dusty window. 3 weeks of bone-jarring travel had brought her from the overcrowded tenements of Boston to this wild, untamed land where everything seemed impossibly vast and intimidating. The letter in her gloved hands was worn soft from repeated readings, its edges frayed from nervous handling. The careful script promised her a new beginning as the wife of Thomas Sinclair, a wheat farmer who claimed to own a modest spread outside Cedar Falls. His letters had been kind but practical, speaking of hard work, simple pleasures, and the chance to build something meaningful together. After the suffocating poverty of her life back east, after watching her younger siblings grow thin while their father drank away what little money they had, the promise of honest work and a roof over her head seemed like salvation itself. Cordelia smoothed her best dress, a deep blue wool that had belonged to her mother before consumption claimed her 5 years prior. It was the finest thing she owned, carefully mended and altered to fit her slender frame. She'd spent her last coins on a small bottle of lavender water and ribbons for her auburn hair, wanting to make the best possible impression on the man who'd agreed to marry a complete stranger based solely on letters and a single daguerreotype. Thus, other passengers in the coach, a traveling salesman with tobacco-stained teeth and a stern-faced woman in widow's weeds, had long since ceased their attempts at conversation. The salesman dozed fitfully, his sample case balanced precariously on his knees, while the widow stared out at the passing landscape with eyes that seemed to see nothing but ghosts. Cordelia envied their apparent ease with this journey that felt to her like leaping off the edge of the known world. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, the stagecoach finally crested a hill, and Cedar Falls spread out below them. Cordelia pressed her face to the window, eager for her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The town was larger than she'd expected, with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings that spoke of recent prosperity. She could make out a church steeple, several saloons, a large general store, and what appeared to be a substantial hotel. Cattle dotted the surrounding valley, and she could see cultivated fields stretching toward the horizon. The coach rolled to a stop in front of the Cedar Falls station with a final bone-jarring lurch. Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her belongings, suddenly wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. What if Thomas Sinclair wasn't the kind man his letters suggested? What if he took one look at her and decided she wasn't worth the price of her passage? She'd spent every cent she had getting here. There was no money for a return ticket, no family left in Boston who would take her back. The driver's weathered face appeared at the window. "Cedar Falls, miss. End of the line." Cordelia stepped down onto the dusty main street, her legs unsteady after days of confinement. The late afternoon air carried the scent of pine, dust, and something else. Opportunity, perhaps, or simply the vastness of the Montana sky. People moved with purpose along the wooden sidewalks, their clothing marking them as everything from simple farmers to well-dressed merchants. She noticed several women in silk dresses that would have cost a year's wages back in Boston, their parasols protecting complexions that spoke of lives free from manual labor. "Miss Ashworth?" The voice was deep, hesitant, and tinged with what might have been nervousness. She turned to find a man approaching, hat in hand, his expression a mixture of hope and anxiety. Thomas Sinclair was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor and kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners. His clothes were clean and well-mended, but clearly the garments of a working man: sturdy boots, worn denim trousers, and a simple cotton shirt that had seen many washings. His dark hair was neatly combed, and she could see he'd made an effort to clean the dirt from under his fingernails. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, offering a small curtsy that felt absurdly formal on the dusty street. "I'm pleased to finally meet you." His smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of worry and revealing the good-natured man whose letters had convinced her to make this leap of faith. "The pleasure's all mine, miss. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. The roads, it can be rough this time of year." "Nothing I couldn't manage," she replied, though her aching bones suggested otherwise. "Your letters mentioned you lived outside town." Thomas nodded, gesturing toward a modest wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "About 5 miles north, I know. It's not much compared to what you're used to in the city, but it's honest work, and the land's good to those who treat it right." As he helped her up onto the wagon seat, Cordelia noticed several people watching them with interest. A group of well-dressed men standing outside what appeared to be a bank were engaged in animated conversation, occasionally glancing in their direction. 2 women in expensive bonnets whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes following every movement. The attention made her uncomfortable, though she supposed the arrival of a mail-order bride was probably noteworthy entertainment in a town this size. Thomas climbed up beside her, his hands steady on the reins as they began the journey to his farm. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they left the bustle of Cedar Falls behind, following a well-maintained road that wound through rolling hills dotted with cattle and sheep. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, transforming the Montana landscape into something almost magical. "It's beautiful," Cordelia said softly, and she meant it. The vastness that had intimidated her from the stagecoach now felt liberating, as if she could finally breathe after years of suffocation in Boston's crowded streets. "Wait until you see it in spring," Thomas replied, his voice warm with genuine affection for the land. "When the wildflowers bloom and the grass turns green, there's no prettier sight in all of Montana Territory. Course, winters can be hard, and the work's never easy, but there's something about this place that gets into your blood." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of leather and the rhythmic clop of hooves on packed earth. Cordelia found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, trying to reconcile his presence with the image she'd built from his letters. He seemed younger than his 32 years, though there were lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the sun, and perhaps worries he hadn't shared in their correspondence. "Mr. Sinclair," she began hesitantly, "I want you to know that I intend to be a good wife to you. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I can cook, clean, and mend with the best of them. I know this arrangement isn't conventional, but I hope we can build something real together." Thomas's hands tightened slightly on the reins, and she caught a flicker of something. Guilt? Anxiety? Cross his features before his expression settled back into its kind lines. "Miss Ashworth, Cordelia, if I may, there are some things about my situation that I should probably explain. Things that weren't entirely clear in my letters." Her heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment when the dream collapsed and reality came crashing down. "What sort of things?" "Well, for starters," Thomas began, then stopped abruptly as they crested a hill and the view opened up before them. Cordelia's breath caught in her throat. Spread out below them was not the modest farmstead she'd been expecting, but something that looked more like a small town unto itself. A magnificent 2-story house dominated the center of the compound, its wraparound porch and gingerbread trim speaking of both wealth and refined taste. Surrounding it were numerous outbuildings, barns, stables, bunkhouses, and what appeared to be workshops. Corrals held dozens of horses, and she could see cattle stretching to the horizon in numbers that made her head spin. "Mr. Sinclair," she whispered, "what exactly do you do here? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you." The hoofbeats thundered closer, and through the tall windows, Cordelia could see the flicker of torches moving like angry fireflies across the darkness. Thomas's face had gone ashen in the lamplight, and she noticed his hand instinctively move toward his hip, where a gun would hang, if this were the simple farmhouse she'd expected, rather than this palace of secrets. "The Grangers," Catherine whispered, her composed mask finally cracking to reveal genuine fear. "I thought we had more time." "Grangers?" Cordelia's voice sounded strange to her own ears, too high and thin. The name meant nothing to her, but the terror it inspired in the others made her mouth go dry. Thomas moved away from the window with swift, practiced motions, and she realized this wasn't the first time he'd faced whatever was coming. "Cordelia, I need you to listen carefully. There's a back stairway that leads to my study. Inside the desk, bottom drawer, there's a key to the root cellar behind the kitchen. Take Victoria and Catherine and—" "I'm not hiding in any cellar," Victoria declared, though her voice trembled slightly. "This is still my home too. It won't be your home much longer if Ezra Granger has his way," Whitmore said grimly, rising from his chair and straightening his vest. "The man's been nursing a grievance against the Sinclair family for 15 years. Your arrival tonight, Miss Ashworth, has given him the perfect excuse to act on it." "My arrival?" Cordelia felt as if she were drowning in other people's history, their feuds and secrets pulling her under. What could my being here possibly have to do with some rancher's dispute? The sound of voices outside grew louder, punctuated by the stamp of horses and the creak of leather. Thomas grabbed her shoulders, his calloused hands warm against the silk of her dress sleeves. This close, she could smell leather and sage on his skin, see the genuine anguish in his brown eyes. "The Grangers lost their homestead 5 years ago when the bank foreclosed. Ezra's blamed me ever since, claimed I influenced the bank's decision. To protect my own interests." Thomas's grip tightened slightly. "He's not entirely wrong. I did speak to the bank president, but only because Ezra had threatened to poison my water sources if I didn't buy his land for twice what it was worth." "Thomas Sinclair!" The voice boomed from outside, carrying the rough authority of a man accustomed to being heard over cattle and wind. "Send out that mail-order bride of yours. Time she met the neighbors." Cordelia's blood turned to ice. They knew about her. Somehow, word of her arrival had already spread, and these men had come specifically because of her presence. "How do they know about me?" "The stage driver," Catherine said bitterly. "Jake Morrison's been Ezra's drinking companion for years. He would have ridden straight to the Granger place after dropping you off in town." Victoria pressed herself against the far wall, her silk dress rustling with each trembling breath. "What do they want with her?" Whitmore's pale eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation. "They want to make sure Thomas's marriage doesn't go through. A married man with a wife to protect has different vulnerabilities than a bachelor with only himself to consider." The front door rattled under heavy fists, and Cordelia jumped at the sound. The pounding continued, steady and implacable, like the heartbeat of something monstrous. She found herself moving closer to Thomas without conscious thought, drawn by the solid strength of his presence, even as her mind reeled with the implications of what Whitmore had said. "Let me understand this," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "These men want to prevent our marriage because they believe a wife would make you more vulnerable to their threats? Or Thomas said quietly. They want to take you hostage, to force me to sign over grazing rights to disputed land. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt more ominous than the noise had been. Cordelia could hear her own heartbeat, the tick of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece, the soft whisper of Victoria's rapid breathing. "There's something else," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you in my letters, but couldn't risk putting in writing." "Thomas, no," Catherine hissed. "She doesn't need to know. She has a right to know what she's walked into." Thomas's eyes never left Cordelia's face. 3 years ago, there was another woman, a teacher from Denver who answered my advertisement. Her name was Margaret Finley. Cordelia's stomach dropped. What happened to her? She disappeared 2 days after arriving in Cedar Falls. We found her trunk by the river, but never found her. His voice grew rougher. Ezra Granger swore publicly that any woman fool enough to marry me would regret it. The territorial marshal investigated but couldn't prove anything. The room seemed to tilt around her. Another woman, another mail-order bride who had vanished without a trace. "And you didn't think to mention this in your letters?" "I thought I could protect you. I thought having more men, better security, would be enough." Thomas's hands fell away from her shoulders. "I thought the danger had passed." A new sound came from outside, not pounding or shouting, but something worse. The scratch of metal against glass, deliberate and measured. Someone was trying to open the windows. "The parlor," Catherine breathed. "They're coming through the parlor." "Windows?" Whitmore pulled a small pistol from inside his jacket, the metal gleaming dully in the lamplight. "Miss Ashworth, whatever happens next, stay close to me. I can offer you protection that Thomas cannot." "Protection?" Cordelia's voice cracked with hysteria. "You mean like the protection Margaret Finley received?" "Margaret made the mistake of trusting the wrong man," Whitmore replied smoothly. "I'm offering you the chance to learn from her error." The scratching at the windows stopped. In the terrible quiet that followed, Cordelia could hear the soft creak of old wood settling, the distant lowing of cattle, and something else. Footsteps on the front porch, moving with careful stealth. Thomas's silence stretched between them like a chasm. Cordelia watched his face, searching for the denial that never came, for some sign that Granger's accusations were the ravings of a bitter man. Instead, she saw something that made her heart constrict with a pain sharper than any physical wound, the look of a man who knew he was about to lose everything that mattered. "Thomas?" Her voice cracked on his name, a question and a plea, wrapped in 2 syllables. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, she saw defeat there. "It's complicated, Cordelia. Complicated." The word tasted like ashes in her mouth. She took a step backward, then another, until the solid wall pressed against her spine. "Margaret Finley is dead, and you call it complicated?" "Margaret is dead. Because she was foolish enough to trust Ezra Granger," Catherine interjected sharply, though her usual composure had cracked to reveal something desperate underneath. "She was a silly girl who got herself killed by wandering around at night in dangerous territory." "Dangerous because of what she knew," Granger countered, his rifle still trained on Thomas, but his eyes fixed on Cordelia. "She found Thomas's father's journals, read about the Henderson family who disappeared after refusing to sell their water rights, about the Cassidy brothers who died in that convenient landslide after they filed a claim on Sinclair grazing land." The ornate clock on the mantelpiece chimed 10 times, each note falling into the silence like a stone into still water. Cordelia found herself counting automatically, her mind grasping for something concrete while the world tilted around her. 10 o'clock. Less than 6 hours ago, she'd been a hopeful bride-to-be stepping off a stagecoach. Now she stood in a drawing room that felt more like a courtroom, listening to accusations of murder against the man she'd agreed to marry. "My father's sins are not mine," Thomas said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. aren't they?" Granger's weathered face creased with bitter satisfaction. "Who do you think taught you to shoot, boy? Who showed you how to read men's weaknesses? Your daddy didn't build this empire with handshakes and honest deals." Victoria, who had been pressed against the far wall like a cornered animal, suddenly found her voice. "Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, what does any of this have to do with poor Margaret?" "Everything," Granger replied, never taking his eyes off Thomas. "Because Margaret wasn't just some naive Eastern girl, she was a Pinkerton detective." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Cordelia felt her knees go weak, and she gripped the windowsill behind her for support. A detective. Margaret Finley had been investigating Thomas, not falling in love with him. "That's impossible," Whitmore said, though his usual smooth confidence had developed a sharp edge. "We investigated her thoroughly before Thomas placed his advertisement. She was exactly what she claimed to be. She was what the Pinkerton agency wanted you to believe she was." Granger's smile was winter cold. "I've been watching the Sinclair family for 2 years, waiting for the right opportunity. When Thomas started advertising for a wife, they saw their chance to get someone inside the house." Thomas had gone very still, his face pale in the lamplight. "How do you know this?" "Because she told me, you fool. Showed me her credentials, her correspondence with her superiors in Denver. She was gathering evidence about your family's land acquisitions, planning to present it to the territorial governor." Granger's voice grew harder. "Until someone put a bullet in her head and dumped her body in the river." The room spun around. Cordelia. She pressed her palms against the cool glass of the window, trying to anchor herself to something solid while her world collapsed. A detective, evidence, murder, and now she was here, another mail-order bride walking into the same trap that had killed Margaret Finley. "You have no proof," Catherine said, but her voice shook. "No evidence that Thomas harmed that woman." "Don't I?" Granger reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age. "Found this in Margaret's room after she disappeared. Seems she was keeping detailed notes about her investigation." He tossed the paper onto the Persian rug. Between them, Thomas made no move to pick it up, but Cordelia could see his hands trembling at his sides. "What does it say?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Read it yourself," Granger challenged. "See what your intended husband is really capable of." Cordelia knelt and picked up the paper with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain steady. The handwriting was precise, feminine, the kind taught in expensive Eastern schools. As she read, her heart sank with each carefully documented sentence. "Subject continues to maintain facade of legitimate businessman, but investigation reveals pattern of intimidation and violence dating back 20 years. Land acquisition methods include arson of competitor homesteads, 1871-1874, poisoning of water sources, 1872, and suspected murder of claim jumpers, 1873-1875. Most disturbing discovery, subject's late father kept detailed records of these activities, apparently as insurance against potential prosecution. Records hidden in concealed compartment of study desk, subject aware of father's crimes, and has continued the practice when necessary to protect family interests." The paper fluttered from Cordelia's nerveless fingers. She looked up to find Thomas watching her with an expression of such profound grief that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Some of it." His voice was barely audible. "My father. He did things, terrible things. I found his records when I inherited the ranch, but I swear to you, Cordelia, I never killed anyone, never ordered anyone killed." "But you knew," Granger said with quiet satisfaction. "You knew where your wealth came from and you used it anyway. Built your life on blood money and called yourself respectable." Thomas's shoulders sagged as if he were carrying an enormous weight. "I tried to make amends, sent money to the families who were hurt, tried to buy land through legal means instead of—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "Instead of murder," Granger finished for him. "But you couldn't resist using the old methods when it suited you, could you? Like when my family wouldn't sell at your price." "I never threatened you," Thomas protested. "I offered fair market value after you poisoned our well and burned our hay crop." Granger's voice rose. "After you made it impossible for us to survive on our land, then you came with your generous offer to buy us out." Cordelia felt sick. Each revelation was worse than the last, peeling away layers of deception to reveal something rotten at the core. The man whose letters had seemed so kind, so honest, was built on a foundation of violence and greed. "And Margaret?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "What happened to Margaret?" "She was going to expose everything," Victoria said suddenly, her voice high and strained. "The night before she disappeared, she came to the house. She told Thomas she knew about his father's crimes, about the hidden records. She said she was giving him one chance to confess before she turned her evidence over to the authorities." "Victoria, don't," Catherine warned, but the younger woman seemed beyond caring about consequences now. "She said she'd been corresponding with the territorial governor, that federal marshals were already on their way to investigate. Thomas begged her to give him more time, to let him handle it quietly." Victoria's voice broke. "But she said innocent. People had died because of this family's greed, and she wouldn't be party to covering it up. So he killed her," Granger said, with grim satisfaction. "No." Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. "I didn't kill Margaret. I couldn't have killed her. No matter what she threatened to do, then who did?" Cordelia asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. The silence that followed was broken only by the tick of the mantelpiece clock and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the darkness. Thomas looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at Victoria, and Victoria stared at the floor with eyes that held too much knowledge. Finally, it was Whitmore who spoke, his voice soft and dangerous. "The interesting thing about Margaret Finley's investigation is that it didn't just focus on the Sinclair family. She was also looking into other large landowners in the territory, other families with questionable histories." He smiled, and Cordelia felt ice water run through her veins. "Families like mine!" The room erupted in chaos. Granger swung his rifle toward Whitmore. Thomas lunged toward Cordelia, and Victoria screamed. But it was Catherine who moved fastest, producing a small pistol from the folds of her skirt and pointing it with steady hands at Granger's chest. "Nobody move," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This has gone quite far enough." In the sudden, terrible silence, Cordelia understood with crystal clarity that she had walked into something far more dangerous than a simple case of marital deception. She was standing in a room full of killers, and the only question was which one of them had murdered Margaret Finley. Thomas reached for her hand, and she was surprised to find herself letting him take it. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and steady despite everything. "Whatever you decide about marrying me, about staying or going, I won't let them hurt. I swear that on my parents' graves." "Pretty words," came a new voice from the doorway, and they all spun toward the sound. A tall man, with greying hair and cold blue eyes, stood framed in the entrance to the drawing room, a rifle cradled casually in his arms. Behind him, two more men with similar hard faces and work-worn clothes. "But we all remember what your promises were worth to Margaret Finley." "Ezra." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Cordelia, though she noticed he made no move toward a weapon. "You're trespassing." "Am I?" Ezra Granger's smile was winter cold. "Funny thing about trespassing, Sinclair. Hard to trespass on land that rightfully belongs to someone else. The territorial court settled the boundary dispute 2 years ago. Courts can be bought. Judges can be influenced." Ezra's gaze moved past Thomas to fix on Cordelia with uncomfortable intensity. But a man's conscience, well, that's harder to purchase, isn't it, miss? Cordelia stepped out from behind Thomas, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. These men might be dangerous, but she was tired of being spoken about as if she weren't in the room, tired of being treated like a chess piece in other people's games. "What do you want with me, Mr. Granger?" His weathered face creased in what might have been surprise or approval. "Direct question deserves a direct answer. I want you to know the truth about the man you've come to marry, about what happened to the last woman who believed his lies, Ezra," Thomas warned, his voice deadly quiet. "Truth is," Granger continued as if Thomas hadn't spoken, "Margaret Finley didn't just disappear, miss. She came to me 2 nights before she vanished. Came to my cabin scared out of her wits, begging for help to get back to Denver." Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face. "Why?" "Because she'd learned what you're learning now. That Thomas Sinclair's wealth comes from more than cattle ranching, that his land holdings weren't acquired through honest business dealings, that the Sinclair family has blood on its hands going back 3 generations. "That's enough!" Thomas's shout echoed through the room, but Granger only smiled wider. She begged me to help her get away before the wedding, said she'd found documents in his study that proved he'd had homesteaders murdered to acquire their land, said she was afraid she'd be next if she tried to leave on her own. The words hit Cordelia like physical blows. Murder, land theft, blood money. She stared at Thomas, searching his face for denial, for some sign that Granger was lying. Thomas's silence told her everything she needed to know. "I told her I'd help her," Granger continued, his voice heavy with old grief. "Told her to meet me by the old bridge at midnight, but she never came. Next morning they found her trunk by the river and claimed she'd run off. But Margaret Finley wasn't the running kind." "You're saying Thomas killed her?" Cordelia's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm saying," Granger replied, raising his rifle slightly, "that Thomas Sinclair has never let anything stand between him and what he wants. And right now, what he wants is a wife to legitimize his stolen empire. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe." Now back to the story. The accusation hung in the air between them like a blade. Cordelia looked from Granger's hard, certain face to Thomas's stricken one, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had turned to quicksand. Everything she thought she knew, every assumption she'd made, crumbled like autumn leaves. "Is it true?" she asked Thomas, her voice barely audible. "Any of it?" "My background," Cordelia's voice grew stronger. "You mean poor. You mean desperate. You mean someone with nothing to lose." She took a step away from the window, ignoring the way Catherine's gun tracked her movement. "You're right about that. I am poor. I was desperate. But you made one crucial mistake." "Which is?" Catherine's tone suggested polite interest, as if they were discussing the weather rather than murder. "You assumed that made me weak." Cordelia's hand moved slowly, carefully, toward the heavy crystal decanter on the side table. "You assumed I'd be grateful for whatever scraps you threw me. You assumed wrong." The movement was swift and desperate. Cordelia grabbed the decanter and hurled it at the lamp nearest Catherine. Glass exploded in a shower of crystal and flame, plunging half the room into darkness. In the chaos that followed, Catherine's shout of surprise, Victoria's scream, the crash of overturning furniture, Cordelia threw herself toward the door. She almost made it. Granger's rough hand caught her arm, spinning her around. In the flickering light from the remaining lamps, his weathered face looked carved from stone. "Not so fast, miss. You and I need to have a talk." Behind them, Catherine was cursing in language that would have shocked her tea-circle, trying to locate her dropped pistol among the scattered glass. Thomas was helping Victoria to her feet, and Whitmore was brushing crystal fragments from his expensive suit with obvious annoyance. "Let me go," Cordelia said, struggling against Granger's iron grip. "Can't do that." His voice was surprisingly gentle. "Not until we finish what we started here tonight." You see, miss, there's one more thing you need to know about Margaret Finley's investigation. I've heard enough, Cordelia said desperately. No, Granger replied, his grip tightening as Catherine finally located her pistol and rose to her feet, with murder in her eyes. You haven't heard the most important part. You haven't heard why Margaret was really killed. Catherine raised her gun, this time pointing it directly at Granger. Ezra, you've said quite enough for one evening. Have I? Granger's smile was grim. Haven't told her about the railroad yet. Haven't mentioned the government contracts or the Indian reservation land deals. Haven't explained why half the territorial legislature wants Thomas Sinclair's marriage to go through and why the other half would kill to stop it. Cordelia felt the last pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture so vast and terrible that her mind recoiled from accepting it. This wasn't just about one family's crimes, or even multiple murders. This was about power, and politics on a scale she'd never imagined. The railroad, she whispered, coming through next year, Granger confirmed, right through the heart of Sinclair land. Governments paying top dollar for the right-of-way, enough to make Thomas one of the richest men in America, but only if he can prove stable ownership, clean title, legitimate operations, which he can't do if his family's criminal history comes to light, Cordelia realized. Now you're beginning to understand. Granger's voice was heavy with satisfaction. Margaret wasn't just investigating old crimes, miss. She was documenting current corruption that goes all the way to Washington. And there are powerful men who'll do anything to keep those secrets buried. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses thundered through the night air. Many horses, moving fast and with military precision. Through the broken window, Cordelia could see torches bobbing in the darkness, getting closer by the second. Catherine's face had gone ashen. The marshals! No, Whitmore said grimly, peering out the window. Worse, those are Pinkerton men. Thomas moved to Cordelia's side, his face grave. Margaret's investigation didn't die with her. The agency kept it going, and now they've come for answers. Outside, voices shouted orders, boots pounded on wooden steps, and the front door rattled under authoritative fists. The net that had been closing around the Sinclair family for months was finally tightening, and Cordelia found herself at the center of a web of corruption and violence that stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined. Open up! Federal agents. The pounding grew more insistent, and Cordelia realized with crystalline clarity that her choices had just narrowed to two: become part of the cover-up or help expose the truth. Either way, the frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the stagecoach that afternoon was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had seen too much to ever go back to innocence. Cordelia's hands had gone numb, the crystal sherry glass slipping from her fingers to shatter against the hardwood floor. The sound seemed to echo through the drawing room like a gunshot, and in the ringing silence that followed, she could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs. The amber liquid spread across the Persian rug, seeping into threads that probably cost more than her father had earned in his lifetime. "I need air," she whispered, pressing her palms against her temples where a fierce headache was building. The room felt impossibly small despite its grandeur, the weight of 3 pairs of eyes studying her every reaction, making it hard to breathe. Thomas moved toward her, concern etched across his features. "Cordelia, don't!" The word came out sharper than she intended, but she couldn't bear his touch right now, couldn't think clearly with him so close. Everything about him was a lie, his clothes, his manner, his supposed simple life. Even his kindness might be calculated, designed to manipulate a desperate woman into a situation she couldn't begin to understand. She stood on unsteady legs and walked to the massive windows, staring out at the gathering darkness where lanterns flickered. In the distant bunkhouses, real working men lived in those buildings, men whose lives weren't built on deception. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fled Boston's suffocating poverty only to find herself trapped in Montana's gilded cage. Behind her, Victoria's voice carried a note of false sympathy. "Perhaps we should postpone dinner. The poor dear seems quite overwhelmed." "I'm not overwhelmed," Cordelia said quietly, not turning from the window. "I'm calculating." Catherine's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Calculating what exactly? Whether I have enough money for a return ticket to Boston." Cordelia traced a finger along the cool glass, watching her reflection waver in the lamplight. "Whether pride is worth more than survival. Whether I can trust anything that comes out of your nephew's mouth." The silence stretched so long, she wondered if they'd all left the room. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion she couldn't identify. "The answer is no. Yes. And I don't." "No." She turned to face him, surprised by his honesty. He'd moved closer, close enough that she could see the genuine pain in his brown eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as if he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. "No, you don't have money for a return ticket. I checked the stage office records before I met you. Yes, pride is worth more than survival, which is why you left Boston in the first place rather than accept charity. And I don't know if you can trust me, because I've already proven that I'm willing to lie to get what I want." His voice dropped lower. "What I don't know is whether you'll give me a chance to explain why." Victoria laughed, the sound like silver, bells with a discordant note. "How refreshingly direct, Thomas. Though I notice you didn't mention that Miss Ashworth has a fourth option." "Which is?" Cordelia asked, though something in Victoria's expression made her stomach clench with dread. "You could marry me instead." The words came not from Victoria, but from a new voice in the doorway. A man stepped into the drawing room with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcome everywhere. He was perhaps 40, with silver-threaded hair and the kind of polished good looks that spoke of careful grooming and expensive tailors. His suit was perfectly cut, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and when he smiled at Cordelia, she felt like prey being sized up by a predator. "Marcus," Catherine breathed, and there was something in her voice, relief, fear, that made Cordelia's skin crawl. Thomas had gone rigid beside her. "What are you doing here, Whitmore?" "Business, as always." Marcus Whitmore's gaze never left Cordelia's face as he moved into the room with predatory grace. "Though I must say, the business has become considerably more interesting since Miss Ashworth's arrival." "I don't understand," Cordelia said, though she was beginning to suspect she understood far too well. "What business could you possibly have with me?" Whitmore settled into the chair she'd vacated, making himself at home with casual arrogance. "My dear Miss Ashworth, surely Thomas has explained the delicate situation regarding his vast holdings and the territorial legislature's recent concerns about concentrated land ownership, Marcus." Thomas's voice carried a warning that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "No? How remiss of him." Whitmore's smile widened, showing teeth too perfect to be entirely natural. "You see, there's been quite a lot of pressure from Washington about the Sinclair Ranch's size and influence. Some unfortunate talk about breaking up large estates, redistributing land to smaller homesteaders. Quite bad for business, as you can imagine." Cordelia sank into another chair, her legs no longer steady enough to support her. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything, my dear. You see, a married man with a stable family life is much less likely to face governmental interference than a bachelor whose loyalties might be questioned. Thomas's marriage isn't just a personal matter, it's a political necessity." The room spun around her as the full implications sank in. She wasn't just a mail-order bride, she was a business arrangement designed to protect a fortune. Her desperation, her hopes for a new life, even her willingness to marry a stranger, all of it had been calculated and exploited. But Whitmore continued smoothly. There's no reason you need to limit yourself to Thomas's offer. I own the second largest spread in the territory, and I can offer you something he cannot. Which is? The words came out as barely a whisper. Honesty. Whitmore leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. I'm not offering you love or even companionship. Miss Ashworth, I'm offering you a straightforward business arrangement, marriage in name only, a generous allowance, and complete freedom to live as you choose. No deception, no false promises of simple farm life. Victoria clapped her hands together in delight. What a marvelous solution. Cordelia gets security without the burden of Thomas's complications, and Thomas remains free to make a more suitable match. The way Victoria's gaze lingered on Thomas made everything click into place for Cordelia. This wasn't about her arrival disrupting anyone's plans. It was about her arrival preventing Victoria from implementing her own. You want to marry him yourself, Cordelia said, the realization giving her voice strength. This whole performance, the helpful suggestions, the concern for my welfare, you want me gone so you can step into my place. Victoria's perfect composure cracked for just an instant, revealing something sharp and desperate underneath. Don't be ridiculous. I'm simply concerned about everyone's happiness. My dear Victoria, Whitmore said with amusement, surely you don't think Miss Ashworth is naive enough to fall for such obvious maneuvering? She's travelled across the country alone, left everything behind for an uncertain future. That takes intelligence and courage, not gullibility. Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. That's enough, all of you. Cordelia isn't a prize to be bartered between us, and she's not a business solution to be negotiated. He turned to her, his eyes pleading. Tell me what you want, not what they want, not what makes sense politically or financially. What do you want? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cordelia looked around the room at the faces watching. Her, Thomas with his desperate hope, Victoria with barely concealed hostility, Catherine with cool calculation, and Whitmore with predatory patience. All of them wanted something from her, and none of them cared what the cost might be to her. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt a spark of the determination that had carried her across the country. These people thought they could manipulate her because she was poor, desperate, and alone. They thought she would be grateful for whatever scraps they chose to throw her way. They were about to learn how wrong they were. What I want, she said, rising to her feet with newfound dignity, is to know exactly what I've walked into before I make any decisions at all. Mr. Sinclair, you claim you want honesty? Then let's have it. All of it. The land disputes, the political pressure. The reason my marriage to you is worth enough to bring Mr. Whitmore out here to make counter-offers. Thomas's face went pale. Cordelia, there are things that could put you in danger if you knew them. I'm already in danger, she replied steadily. The question is whether I'll face it with knowledge or with ignorance. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats outside, many hoofbeats moving fast and with purpose. Thomas went to the window, and his expression made Cordelia's blood run cold. We're out of time, he said grimly. They're here. The pounding at the front door grew more insistent, accompanied by the splintering sound of wood beginning to give way. Catherine's pistol wavered between Cordelia and the approaching threat, her composed mask finally cracking to reveal the desperation. Beneath, in the dancing shadows cast by the remaining lamps, her face looked carved from ancient ivory, beautiful and terrible. The back stairs, she hissed to Thomas. Take Victoria and get to the root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft. You can reach the horses from there. I'm not leaving Cordelia, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Then you're a fool. Catherine's eyes glittered with something between fury and grief. I didn't kill Margaret Finlay to watch you throw everything away for another mail-order bride. The words hit Cordelia like a slap. Even now, facing exposure and arrest, Catherine saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle. The realization burned away the last of her fear, leaving something harder and more dangerous in its place. "Let me go, Mr. Granger," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise of splintering wood and shouting voices. "Can't do that, miss. Not until—" Cordelia drove her elbow back into his ribs with all the force she could muster. Growing up in Boston's tenements had taught her things that finishing schools never covered. Lessons learned in alleys where pretty words meant nothing and survival meant fighting dirty. Granger's grip loosened with a grunt of pain, and she wrenched free just as the front door exploded inward. Men in dark suits poured through the opening, their faces grim and professional. Federal agents, just as Whitmore had predicted. But something about their movements suggested they weren't here for a polite conversation. These were men who'd come expecting trouble and were prepared to meet it with force. "Nobody move." The lead agent's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Hands where we can see them." Catherine's response was to raise her pistol toward the agents, and Cordelia knew with sickening certainty that the elegant older woman was about to get herself killed rather than face arrest. Time seemed to slow as she watched Catherine's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the federal agents reaching for their own weapons, felt the weight of Margaret Finley's murder about to be compounded by even more bloodshed. "Don't!" Cordelia threw herself forward, not towards safety but toward Catherine, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain. Her shoulder caught the older woman in the midsection, sending them both crashing to the floor in a tangle of silk skirts and broken glass. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, plaster raining down like snow. Catherine struggled beneath her, stronger than her refined appearance suggested, her manicured nails drawing blood from Cordelia's cheek. But desperation gave Cordelia strength she didn't know she possessed, and she managed to pin Catherine's gun hand to the floor until one of the agents could kick the weapon away. "That was either very brave or very stupid," the lead agent said, helping Cordelia to her feet. His eyes were kind but tired, the look of a man who'd seen too much of humanity's darker nature. "Agent Daniel Morrison, Pinkerton Detective Agency." "Morrison?" Granger breathed, lowering his rifle. "Jake Morrison's boy." "His nephew. Jake told me you'd been trying to get someone to listen about the Sinclair family for years." Agent Morrison's gaze swept the room, taking in the overturned furniture, the broken glass, the faces of the people who'd been trapped in this web of secrets. "Looks like tonight was the night everything came to light." Catherine was hauled to her feet by two agents, her perfect composure finally shattered. Without her usual armor of refinement, she looked smaller, older, more human. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said to Morrison. "The railroad contracts alone are worth millions. There are senators, congressmen, territorial officials. They'll never let this investigation proceed." "That's where you're wrong, Mom." Morrison's smile was grim. "You see, Margaret Finley wasn't working alone. She had partners, backup plans, evidence cached in multiple locations. Her death just convinced us we were on the right track." He pulled a thick folder from inside his coat, pages and pages of documents that rustled like dry leaves. Bank records, land transfers, witness statements, photographs of your late husband's journals. 3 years of investigation, Mrs. Sinclair. Your nephew's marriage plans just gave us the excuse we needed to move. Openly. My husband's journals were destroyed, Catherine said, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes. The ones in the study desk were destroyed, Morrison agreed. Margaret made sure of that before her final meeting with you, but she'd already photographed every page, along with the records of recent bribes paid to territorial officials and railroad executives. Thomas had gone very pale. "How much do you know?" "Everything." Morrison's voice was quietly satisfied. "The Henderson family fire, The Cassidy brothers' landslide, the poisoned wells, the intimidated witnesses. Your father was very thorough. In his record-keeping, Mr. Sinclair, almost like he knew someone would need proof of his activities someday. I never killed anyone, Thomas said desperately. I swear to you, I never personally harmed, but you knew. Morrison's interruption was gentle but implacable. You inherited those records, that blood money, and you used it to build an even larger empire. The railroad deal alone would have made you worth more than some entire states. Cordelia found herself thinking of Margaret Finley again, of the courage it must have taken to walk into this house knowing the danger she faced. A woman not so different from herself, seeking truth instead of a new life, but paying the same price for her presence in this cursed place. What happens now? She asked Morrison. Now we sort through the evidence, make arrests, prepare for trial. His eyes softened as he looked at her. As for you, Miss Ashworth, you're free to go. We'll provide transportation back east if you wish, along with compensation for your troubles. And if I don't wish to go back east, Morrison raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, Margaret Finley came here to expose the truth, Cordelia said slowly, the words forming as she spoke them. She died because she believed justice mattered more than her own safety. If I leave now, if I let fear drive me away, then her sacrifice means nothing. Cordelia, Thomas said quietly, you don't owe us anything. You don't owe me anything. You should go, start over somewhere safe. She turned to look at him. This man who'd lied to her about everything except perhaps his capacity for remorse. His brown eyes held genuine pain, not for his impending arrest, but for the hurt he'd caused her, the dreams he'd shattered with his deceptions. You're right, she said. I don't owe you anything, but I owe something to myself, which is the chance to see this through, to make sure that everyone who profited from murder faces justice, to ensure that Margaret Finley's investigation wasn't wasted. She straightened her shoulders, feeling something settle into place inside her chest. I want to testify, Agent Morrison. I want to tell a jury what I heard tonight, what I witnessed. Morrison nodded approvingly. It'll be dangerous, miss. These people have powerful friends, deep pockets. They'll try to discredit you, maybe even threaten you. Let them try. Cordelia's voice was steady, stronger than she'd ever heard it. I've been poor, desperate, and alone. I've survived tenements and textile mills, and men who thought my poverty made me powerless. I can survive whatever they have to throw at me. As the agents led Catherine and the others away in handcuffs, Cordelia stood in the wreckage of the drawing room and felt something she'd never experienced before. Not happiness, not relief, but a deep sense of rightness. She'd come to Montana Territory seeking a new life, and she'd found one, though not at all in the way she'd expected. The woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach that afternoon had been running from her past, desperate for any chance at security. The woman who remained was someone different entirely, someone who'd chosen justice over safety, truth over comfort, courage over fear. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. A new day was coming to Montana Territory, and with it, the promise that some secrets couldn't stay buried forever. Margaret Finley would have her justice at last. 3 months later, Cordelia stood on the courthouse steps in Helena, Montana Territory, watching the last of the newspaper reporters disperse into the crisp October afternoon. The trial of Catherine Sinclair had concluded that morning with a guilty verdict for the murder of Margaret Finley, and the weight of testimony Cordelia had given over the past weeks felt both heavy and liberating on her shoulders. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter, reminding her how much her life had changed since that dusty evening when she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Cedar Falls. The woman in the blue wool traveling dress had been replaced by someone wearing a practical grey suit, purchased with her own earnings, Money earned not through marriage or charity, but through honest work as a clerk for the Territorial Prosecutor's Office. Miss Ashworth. Agent Morrison approached, his face showing the satisfaction of a man who'd seen justice served after long months of patient investigation. I wanted to thank you again before I head back to Denver. Your testimony was crucial in securing the conviction. It was the right thing to do, Cordelia replied, though even now she could feel the tremor in her hands that came whenever she thought too deeply about the risks she'd taken. Margaret Finley deserved better than to disappear without a trace. She did indeed. Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. I hope you know that your courage in coming forward has consequences beyond this single case. The railroad corruption investigation is expanding to 3 territories now. Your willingness to testify gave other witnesses the strength to speak up. Cordelia nodded, though part of her wondered if she truly understood what she was choosing that night in the Sinclair drawing room. The past 3 months had brought death threats, attempts at bribery, and pressure from powerful men who wanted her to recant her testimony. More than once, she'd awakened in her modest boarding-house room with her heart pounding, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But then she'd think of Margaret Finley, a woman she'd never met but felt she knew intimately through the investigation, and find the strength to continue. What will happen to Thomas? She asked, the question that had been weighing on her heart throughout the trial. Morrison's expression softened slightly. Prison, but not for life. His cooperation with the investigation, combined with evidence that he never personally ordered anyone's death, worked in his favor. The judge gave him 10 years, with possibility of parole in 7 if he continues to assist in related cases. 10 years. Cordelia felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow at the news. Thomas had been weak rather than evil, complicit rather than actively murderous, but the cost of his family's crimes had still been measured in lives, including, in some ways, her own, the life she'd planned, the simple future she'd dreamed of during those long weeks of travel from Boston. He asked me to give you this, Morrison continued, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. I've read it, of course. We had to check all correspondence for security purposes. Well, you should read it yourself. Cordelia took the letter, with fingers that barely trembled, proud of how steady her hands had become over these months of testimony and public scrutiny. Thomas's familiar handwriting looked different somehow, less confident, marked by the weight of consequences he could no longer avoid. Cordelia, I know I have no right to write to you, no right to ask for your understanding or forgiveness. I know that everything I told you about myself was built on lies, and that those lies cost us both any chance at the life we might have had together. But I wanted you to know that watching you choose courage over safety, truth over comfort, has been the most humbling experience of my life. You came to Montana Territory looking for a simple farmer who would treat you with kindness and respect. Instead, you found a coward who had built his life on his family's crimes. Yet somehow, in the midst of all that darkness, you found a strength I never possessed. You chose to stand up for a woman you'd never met, to risk your own safety for the sake of justice. Margaret Finley would be proud to know that her investigation ultimately succeeded because of your courage. I've signed over the deed to a small property in Billings, 160 acres of good farmland, free and clear, along with enough money to build a house and support yourself until the land becomes profitable. It's not charity, Cordelia. It's what I should have offered you from the beginning, a real chance at the independent life you deserve. I don't ask for your forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it. I only ask that you believe me when I say that if I could change the past, make different choices, be the man you thought you were coming to marry, I would do so without hesitation. The woman who stepped off that stagecoach 3 months ago was brave enough to cross a continent for a chance at happiness. The woman who chose to testify against my family is brave enough to build something better than anything I could have given you. I hope you find the peace and security you were seeking, Cordelia. You've earned both. Thomas. Cordelia folded the letter carefully. Her eyes burning with tears, she refused to shed in public. The man who'd written these words was not the same one who'd met her at the stagecoach with nervous lies and desperate hope. Prison and consequences had a way of showing people who they really were beneath their comfortable deceptions. "Will you accept his offer?" Morrison asked gently. "I don't know," Cordelia admitted. "Part of me thinks I should refuse it, that accepting anything from the Sinclair family would be like profiting from their crimes. And the other part remembers that I came here looking for a chance to build something of my own." She looked out at the bustling streets of Helena, where merchants and farmers and ordinary people went about their daily business, most of them unaware of the corruption that had been festering in their territorial government. Maybe using Thomas's guilt to create something good is another kind of justice. Morrison smiled. "Margaret Finley would have liked you, Miss Ashworth. She believed that the best way to fight corruption was to build something better in its place. Did you know her?" Well enough to know that she chose her dangerous assignment, not because she was fearless, but because she was afraid of what would happen if good people did nothing. Morrison tipped his hat. "Rather like someone else I could mention." As Morrison walked away, Cordelia remained on the courthouse steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become as familiar as the Boston skyline she'd left behind. Tomorrow, she would need to decide what to do with Thomas's offer, where to go next, how to build a future from the wreckage of the dreams that had brought her west. But tonight, she felt something she'd never experienced before. The deep satisfaction of knowing she'd chosen correctly when the choice mattered most. She'd come to Montana Territory as a desperate woman fleeing poverty and hopelessness. She was staying as someone who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly, despite it. The mail-order bride who'd answered Thomas Sinclair's advertisement was gone, replaced by a woman who'd discovered her own strength in the crucible of other people's secrets and lies. Whatever came next, whether she took the land in Billings, returned east, or found some entirely different path, she would face it as herself, not as someone's desperate solution to loneliness. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Cordelia Ashworth walked down the courthouse steps and into her own future, carrying with her the knowledge that some journeys end exactly where they're supposed to, even if the destination isn't what you expected when you bought your ticket. Behind her, the courthouse clock chimed 7 times, marking not just the hour, but the end of one story and the beginning of another. In the growing darkness, Montana Territory settled into another peaceful night, a little more just than it had been the day before, thanks to the courage of women who refused to let truth stay buried. Margaret Finley could rest in peace at last, and Cordelia Ashworth could finally begin to live. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Catherine's pistol gleamed in the lamplight, steady as a rock despite her advanced years. The silence stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the soft wheeze of Victoria's panicked breathing and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Cordelia found herself studying Catherine's face, seeing for the first time the steel beneath the refined exterior, the kind of hardness that came from years of making impossible choices. "Aunt Catherine," Thomas said carefully, his voice the tone one might use with a spooked horse. "Put the gun down, please." "I think not." Catherine's cultured accent hadn't changed, but something fundamental had shifted in her bearing. Gone was the genteel ranch matron. In her place stood someone who clearly knew how to use the weapon in her hands. There are too many loose ends in this room, and I've spent too many years keeping this family's secrets to let them unravel now." Cordelia's mouth had gone dry as dust. She pressed herself harder against the window, the cool glass a shock against her overheated skin. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, as if she were watching this scene unfold from a great distance. The woman who had poured sherry and made polite conversation about dinner was now holding them all at gunpoint, and the terrible thing was how natural she looked doing it. "You killed her," Granger said, his own rifle forgotten as he stared at Catherine with something like admiration. "You killed Margaret Finley." "I protected my family," Catherine corrected calmly, "just as I've been doing for 40 years, just as I'll continue to do for as long as necessary." The admission hit Cordelia like a physical blow. She doubled over, her hands pressed to her stomach as nausea rolled through her. Margaret Finley, a woman not so different from herself, seeking a new life in Montana Territory, murdered by this elegant lady who served tea in china cups and worried about dinner. Being late. "She was innocent," Cordelia whispered, straightening slowly. "She was just doing her job. Her job was destroying my nephew's life," Catherine replied, without a trace of remorse. "Destroying everything 3 generations of Sinclair men built. From nothing. I couldn't allow that." Thomas had gone very pale, his hands hanging limp at his sides. "Aunt Catherine, what have you done? What you were too weak to do yourself." Catherine's tone carried the sharp edge of disappointment. "Margaret Finley came to me after her little confrontation with you, Thomas. She thought she could convince the women of the family to pressure you into confessing. She actually believed I would help her destroy us for the sake of her precious justice." "So you shot her," Granger said flatly. "I invited her for tea." Catherine's smile was terrible in its pleasantness. "We had a lovely conversation about her investigation, her evidence, her plans to involve the federal authorities. I complimented her on her thoroughness, her dedication, and then, when she turned to leave," Catherine shrugged delicately, "well, sometimes drastic measures are required to protect those we love." Cordelia felt the room spinning around her. The elegant woman with perfect posture had murdered another human being with the same casual efficiency she might use to arrange flowers. Where is she?" "The river was quite swollen that spring," Catherine said conversationally. "Bodies have a way of disappearing in fast water, especially when they're weighted down properly. Though I did keep her investigative notes. One never knows when such things might prove useful." The matter-of-fact tone was somehow more horrifying than any dramatic confession could have been. Cordelia found herself thinking of Margaret Finley's final moments, of the terror she must have felt, realizing that the refined lady pouring tea was about to kill her. Her stomach lurched, and she had to fight to keep from vomiting. "You're insane," Victoria breathed, her face white as porcelain. "I'm practical," Catherine corrected, "which is more than I can say for the rest of you. Thomas, too soft-hearted to do what's necessary. You, Victoria, too concerned with your own comfort to see the bigger picture. And now we have Miss Ashworth, another potential problem walking right into our lives." The words sent ice through Cordelia's veins. "I'm not a problem. I don't know anything about your family's activities." "But you will," Catherine said reasonably, "just as Margaret did. Curious minds have a way of uncovering inconvenient truths, especially when they're living in the same house as those truths. And I'm rather too old to start disposing of bodies on a regular basis." "Catherine, no." Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised placatingly. "Cordelia isn't a threat. She's just a woman looking for a new life. We can send her back east, give her money to start over with what she's heard tonight." Catherine's laugh was silver-bright and utterly cold. "Really, Thomas, I credited you with more intelligence. Miss Ashworth now knows about your father's crimes, about Margaret's investigation, about my intervention. She's become a liability we simply cannot afford." The pistol shifted slightly, its barrel now pointed directly at Cordelia's chest. She stared into that small, dark circle and felt her life narrowing to this single moment, this breath, this heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear her mother's voice telling her to be brave, her father's drunken ramblings about the sins of the rich, her own desperate prayers for a chance at something better. Wait. Whitmore's voice cut through the deadly silence. Before you do something irreversible, Catherine, perhaps we should consider other options, such as marriage to me, as I suggested earlier. Whitmore's pale eyes fixed on Cordelia with predatory intensity. A business arrangement that would ensure Miss Ashworth's silence while providing her with security. Dead women tell no tales, but neither do wives who understand the value of discretion. Catherine considered this, her gun hand never wavering. And if she refuses your generous offer, then we proceed with your original plan. Whitmore's smile was razor-thin, but I suspect Miss Ashworth is a practical woman who understands the value of survival. All eyes turned to Cordelia, and she felt the weight of their expectations, their calculations, their complete disregard for her humanity. She was nothing to them but a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied up. The realization brought with it a strange kind of clarity, burning away the shock and fear to reveal something harder underneath. "You're all monsters," she said quietly. "We're survivors," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference, though I don't expect someone of your background to understand the distinction."